Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Debbie Stevens, and I'm a physician and the director of the CLL and lymphoma program at the University of Utah Huntsman Cancer Institute. I'm really honored today to be joined by Dr. Matt Davids, and I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Davids. I'm at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. I'm the clinical research director for our division of lymphoma, and I'm a CLL specialist.
Thanks so much for joining us today. The purpose of our interview today is to talk about some research that you presented at ASH 2022. And the title of the paper was Lisaftoclax Safety and Activity as Monotherapy or Combined with acalabrutinib or rituximab in patients with treatment-naive or relapsed and refractory CLL. So before we get started on this particular research project, could you tell us what is Lisaftoclax?
Sure. So Lisaftoclax is an oral inhibitor, so a pill that targets a protein called BCL2. And if you are familiar with CLL, this may sound familiar because we already have a pill like this called venetoclax that's approved for CLL. So this is a different drug being developed by a different company. And as you'll see when we talk about the study, there's kind of some differences in how this drug is being developed for patients with CLL.
That's great. Maybe you'll get into this, but is there a benefit to using Lisaftoclax over venetoclax or a perceived benefit?
Yeah, so we don't know yet. The study that I was presenting was really the first study to focus exclusively on CLL with Lisaftoclax. So we don't have any sort of comparative data comparing it to venetoclax yet. But one of the main differences with this study is that with Lisaftoclax, what we tried to do was actually do the ramp up. In other words, increasing the dose of the drug on a daily basis instead of what they do with venetoclax, which you may be familiar is the 5-week ramp up. With the idea that if we could do this quickly over the course of 5 days, as long as that's a safe approach, that this could be more convenient for patients to kind of get up to the full dose quickly.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be a lot more convenient for patients to do a quicker ramp up and maybe better to control the disease a little bit quicker manner. So tell us about the study that you presented.
So this is a pretty large study. We actually had 164 patients with CLL. These were all, this was a mix of mostly patients with relapsed CLL. In other words, they had had other treatments previously, and then a smaller group of patients where this was their first therapy for CLL. And there were really 3 main parts to the study. There was an initial part where we were looking at Lisaftoclax on its own as a single drug. And then once we showed that that was safe and had good activity against killing CLL cells, then we explored a couple different combinations. So one was combination of the Lisaftoclax pills with an infusion of the antibody rituximab. And then the other part of the study was combining the pills with a different pill, acalabrutinib, which is already approved in CLL.
That's great. And did the combination work?
Yeah, so I mean, the first question was, was this a safe combination? And the answer seems to be yes. We saw some of the typical side effects that we might expect from the drugs in this class. So, for example, the neutrophils were low in a fair number of patients. Neutrophils are some of your main infection-fighting white blood cells, and so there was an increased risk of infection. This is something that we have seen with other drugs in CLL as well. One of the unfortunate aspects of this study was the timing was such that it really took place during the heart of the early part of the pandemic and included several sites around the world, including in Eastern Europe, where they didn't have access to a lot of sophisticated care for COVID at that time. So because of that, unfortunately, there were quite a few COVID infections on this study, including some fatal COVID infections. I think that really had to do mostly with the areas where the study was being done and the timing of the study. Beyond that, really the side effect profile of this looked quite good. And so, I think then the next question was how effective was Lisaftoclax? And what we saw was that, even in these relapsed patients who had had other treatments for the CLL, about 2/3 of them had a response to the Lisaftoclax on its own. And the numbers were even higher when we did the combination. So with the rituximab combination, it was about 80% of patients who had a good benefit. And with acalabrutinib, it was 98%. So all but one of the patients had an excellent response to the combination. So I think so far from these early data, it suggests that Lisaftoclax is going to be well tolerated and highly effective in CLL. And I think the big question in my mind was, was this daily dose ramp up going to be feasible or not? And in 164 patients, we did see 4 patients who experienced some tumor lysis syndrome, or TLS. This is the problem that we're watching closely for. This is when CLL cells break open too quickly because it's such a powerful drug, and it's something that was seen before with venetoclax, so we were looking very carefully for it here. Two of the patients did have some clinical issues with that, but very quickly were able to have those resolved and continue back on the drug. And in two of the patients, it was just some laboratory changes that resolved quickly, and the patients were able to continue on the drug. So about 4 patients out of 164, it certainly suggests that close monitoring is still warranted with this strategy, but I think it did demonstrate the feasibility of doing a daily ramp up with a BCL2 inhibitor drug like this. We'll need longer term data and more patients treated to understand your initial question about how this drug might compare to venetoclax. But certainly from these early data, I think it looks promising.
That's great. So it sounds like a pretty reasonable toxicity profile and really great outcomes for the patients so far. Are there any data in this study or other studies that you could use Lisaftoclax after somebody's CLL has already progressed on venetoclax, or would you anticipate this would be something you would use before venetoclax, maybe down the road?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's not a lot of data from this study to address that particular question. There were some patients included on this study who had had prior venetoclax as a time-limited regimen, meaning they got it for, let's say, a year in the frontline setting and responded, and then came off the drug because they were doing well, and then later came on this study and responded. So there were a handful of patients like that. There were no patients on this study who had had worsening of their CLL while they were on venetoclax. I think that would be very interesting to show that this drug could be effective in that population. I would say from the laboratory data that we have on Lisaftoclax, I would not be super optimistic that they would respond if they had these particular resistance mutations that we've seen in patients progressing on venetoclax, but it is certainly an interesting question that we could look at. To your point, I think this is a drug that may be used sort of in place of venetoclax rather than after venetoclax if the larger data sets pan out with this drug.
Got it. I know this drug has not yet been approved. It's only available on clinical trials. Is this particular trial still enrolling, or how might patients find a clinical trial with this drug?
So this trial is still enrolling for the moment, although I would say it's a large study and we're kind of winding down at this point. So there's probably not many slots left. And that's because the company is in the process of planning a larger phase 3 study, what we call a registrational trial, which is the type of study that could eventually lead to FDA approval if it looks promising. And the idea with that registrational study is likely going to be a combination of Lisaftoclax with acalabrutinib and trying to go for sort of an approval in that kind of doublet combination setting, as we would say. And so that's not yet open, but certainly if that study does open down the line, I encourage patients to consider enrolling.
That's great. And I often tell patients to check out clinicaltrials.gov and or checking in with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, the CLL Society, the Lymphoma Research Foundation can often help you find trials like this. Well, this is all really exciting. Looks like a promising drug, a promising combination. So I just wanted to say thanks so much for meeting with us today and explaining your study.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Debbie.